Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. Today's class starts a new study of another book in the New Testament, specifically the Epistle to the Philippians. This fits well, really, as to follow our recent study of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, as we're in at least the same region of Macedonia. Just the Thessalonian city is further away and a much bigger city. Today's lesson, it will be the introductory lesson to this epistle. We will not be reading scripture. Instead, we will cover some background historical information concerning Philippi and other items that should help us understand a little better what the epistle might have meant at the time it was written and to whom it was written to, before we get into the direct study of the text starting next week. The founding of the Christian church at Philippi was during Paul's second missionary journey, which is described in Acts 16 verses 1 through 40. I strongly urge you to read that before you study Philippians, as Paul does not address any of what Luke has there in Acts concerning that, and yet it is some important information. How much it might or might not agree with Philippians is not the issue. The issue is, unlike many of the other letters, there's no information here concerning the founding other than what's in Acts. So Paul here in this letter, unlike with the Thessalonian letters, he or whomever wrote them is not addressing a struggling new congregation, but instead a mature congregation, one that he feels well established and that he has tremendous love and respect for. And we'll see that throughout this letter of Philippians. In 1st century AD, Philippians was a small but very important city in the Roman colony of Greek Macedonia, which is on the European mainland. It's about 1/10 the size of Thessalonica, with approximately, at the time they think, about 10,000 people, and was located on the Egnatian Highway that connected Greece, Europe to the west, and Asia to the east. A very strategic roadway that the Romans had built. It also had good sea access, as it was about 8 miles north inland at the head of the Aegean Sea, near about 8 miles also from the port of Neapolis. It was a very significant and strategically located military outpost for the Roman imperial army, as it sat at the base of a mountain and overlooked the coastal plain, at this point a narrow and ending coastal plain and marshland. In fact, several wars were fought in this area, very significant events in the history. Circassians were a native population that long occupied this area in the 4th century BC, and they were conquered and displaced, much displaced by Philip II of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, in the 4th century BC. He named it Philippi after himself because of its strategic importance, as well as possibly some other things. He colonized it with Macedonians at the time, and his son, Alexander the Great, added many Greeks to the population there to help Hellenize the city and region. Rome took it in 168 BC when they defeated the Persians who had displaced the Greeks in the area. This region is also where Octavian and Mark Antony defeated Cassius and Brutus in 42 BC during the Roman Civil War, following the assassination of Julius Caesar, which occurred there in 42 BC, or thereabouts. 10 years later, Octavian defeated Mark Antony essentially nearby and became the emperor, Roman Emperor Caesar Augustus. So this little area, because of its strategic location, was a very important landmass from a military standpoint. And the Romans therefore intended to keep it because it was strategic. By Paul's time, Philippi was a Roman city with Roman law and Roman citizenship rights of owning land without poll tax and without land tax. But just how Roman they were ethically at that time of Paul is debatable, scholars report. Several scholars report there were clearly Italian Romans that were ex-soldiers, veterans if you will, who had been released in this area, in part probably, and they settled the area, and in part they think to maintain Roman loyalty. They displaced much of the Greek land ownership, if not wholly, at least in large part. However, the best evidence archaeologically indicates that this was a Romanized Greek Macedonian hybrid culture. You see evidence of all three dating to this time of Paul. There is little evidence to support a Jewish population, however, like we've seen in many of the areas where Paul establishes churches. That would date back to Paul's time there. The archaeological evidence doesn't support the presence of a synagogue in Philippi until a good time later than Paul. The official language was Latin, but the people mainly spoke Greek and wrote in the Greek language, which Paul's going to use as he writes this epistle. It's written originally in Greek. You will see Latin names, however, because a lot of the people carried both a Latin name and a Greek name. The date of this church's establishment at Philippi is debated among scholars, ranging from the late 40s to the early 50s, though. About a 5-year period there, you'll see from 47 to 52, somewhere in that range. You'll see there's not good agreement on settling on a specific date. It is considered to be, however, very important as the first Christian church established on the European mainland. And it's established in a very critical strategic place where the church can move. At the time Paul founded it, the Gentiles were worshiping the series of emperor gods, Julius, Augustus, and Claudius. Also, they were worshiping the Egyptian gods. They were worshiping a wide range of Roman and Greek pagan cultic gods, if you will. As one scholar puts it, a god to everything. There was a god to everything. Paul does not acknowledge the presence of a Jewish congregation here. unless that's what he's doing in Acts, where Luke writes that about Paul going to the river and describes an event there on the Sabbath. Some scholars suggest that Paul went to that river in Acts there on the Sabbath, if there was no synagogue, for the purpose of purification, to find an adequate source of a purification, which a river would provide, a natural river would provide. And then, if there was no synagogue, this would be a normal move. Because after all, folks, we've got to still remember that Paul is practicing both Judaism and Christianity, you might say. He's a Jewish Christian coming from that background, and as we clearly see in Romans, he describes how he envisions Christianity fitting into the Abrahamic covenant. It is believed this letter was sent years later than when this church was established, and it was sent from Paul and Timothy, if you'll notice when we start reading. However, Paul, as the author, has never been seriously questioned. The scholars, everyone I read, clearly feels like this is a genuine Paul. Thus, Philippians is considered one of the 7 genuine Paul-authored letters in the New Testament, which, in addition to Philippians, include Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Most scholars suspect that Timothy had little, if anything, to do with the authorship of the letter. However, scholars do raise issues with the integrity of this letter in the form we have it in our New Testament, because mainly centered around the fact that there's some very abrupt changes that occur in chapters 3 and 4. Some strongly argue that this letter that we have is a hybrid composite of at least 3 letters. And one of their strongest arguments that they cite for that is a surviving writing, evidence of a writing of Bishop Polycarp in the 2nd century, I think roughly the middle of the century, but I'm not sure of that. This would be the 2nd century AD, after Paul, referring to Paul's letters in the plural to the Philippians. Philippians is one of Paul's prison letters. The late Dr. Charles Hosser, professor of New Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary, I believe that's in Decatur, Georgia. It's in the South, I'm not exactly sure where, wrote in his commentary that Paul makes it clear repeatedly that he is in prison, and he assumes his audience knows exactly where he's at in prison as they send him gifts. So there's no mention of specifically where he's at, but he's made clear that he's in prison, he's in chains. Tradition assumes, however, that that prison was in Rome, and he's there on a capital charge. Thus, it carries the death penalty if he's found guilty. But that location is strongly debated by some scholars, mainly because of some of the discussion that is found here in Philippians, and that is that if he's in Rome, it's 800 miles away from Philippi, and he describes, one of the people we'll learn about is a man who makes 3 trips, and he's a sick man, to bring gifts from Philippi to Paul on behalf of the congregation. So, many scholars, and this happens during a 2-year period, and so therefore many people feel that under the conditions to travel in those days, they just can't buy that. Such travel, as one says, seems to be unreasonable. Caesarea and Ephesians are considered as other possible sites, and essentially they are going where they're locating. They're looking at possibilities of where there are imperial headquarters other than Rome. And in imperial headquarters, you also had patriarchal guards, which were the emperor's guards that guarded prisoners, capital prisoners, and as well as other duties. And also, Paul mentions his communications here with the imperial family, which would included the households. In other words, housekeepers and also under these periods of times were considered to be part of the household, not necessarily referring to the biological family or the genetic family, but people that worked in that house were part of the family. Dating of the letter has not been well established, and there's not great agreement on it. And generally they don't try to spend much time on it, the scholars don't, other than saying what date you choose is going to depend on which prison you think he was in. In other words, it's very good agreement that he's in prison when he writes, but where he was at is not there. If he was in Rome, there's very good agreement that if that's where he's at, then it's got to be somewhere between 60 and 64 AD that he's writing this letter. On the other hand, if he's in Ephesians, which they feel is the more likely secondary choice, it would be much earlier, 52 to 55 AD. The purpose of this letter to the Philippians seems to be multiple, teaches most scholars. First of all, it is clearly a thank you letter of Paul to this congregation at Philippi for their repeated gifts to him while he's in prison. In other words, they're supporting him with gifts. We don't know what those gifts were. There's no mention of them. But Paul's gratitude towards them for that support is clearly reflected. Paul also seems, and it seems to be reflected as a driver of why the letter is needed. It may have been the primary driver for why the letter was needed, and why he's writing the letter, then he takes an opportunity to do some other things. What are some of those other things? Paul also seems to be trying to bridge this emotional pastoral distance, since he's a long way away from them, they think, to his congregation. And he expresses, and he has a lot of emotional love for these people, and therefore he's expressing how he longs for them and he misses them, and how much joy. He uses the theme of joy and concern for them and their concern for him at least 15 times, maybe more in this letter. So it's a dominant issue, clearly. Dr. Fred Craddock, in one of the older commentaries, but respected commentaries, writes that this is also a pastoral devotional letter, and the church has long used it as such. But he quickly notes, we must clearly understand it was a letter to a particular church in time and space. It was to the Philippians. It was not written for us today, he says. It becomes a letter, or became a letter, to the church of today, not by Paul's doings, but by the canon father's decision to consider it as the Word. That is a tremendously critical concept to digest and understand, says Dr. Morna D. Hooker at the Divinity School in Cambridge, Great Britain. She takes right off on Dr. Craddock's comments there. The New Testament canon is a statement where the church forefather, she says, conveys the idea that certain literature is to be understood as to the Word, which explains to us the understanding of who and what God is and does through Jesus Christ, and is the true understanding of what God expects men and women should be and do. The gospel story of Christ plays a strong implied role throughout this epistle, she says. But we have to kind of keep that idea in mind because Paul doesn't say it directly that way. So we will need to watch carefully, some scholars say, as we study in order to abstract the eschatological standing or understanding that Paul has here and some of his theology that he's implying here. He also, we'll pick this up as we see where he espouses some very strong moral and ethical exhortations, instructions, if you will. He gives his audience, he's given these moral instructions to these people as a pastor in the absence of him being able to physically be there. This letter is very much also about worship of God and obedience to God and Christ, Christ's will, regardless of, especially under whatever circumstances, regardless of the circumstances you find yourself in life. It's very much that, several scholars point out. There's a lot of devotional material here, and it's used by the church as such. Dr. Kosser closes with this idea that it is so amazing that the Apostle Paul can attach the adverb always to his exhortations to rejoice with constant joys when you consider the circumstances he's in. He's in chains. He's in prison under a capital offense. And most likely has a pretty good idea that he will not survive this. If he does, he knows God has interceded directly on his behalf, one scholar says. The location of the Philippian church, however, at the strategic location that it's at in its time and place in history, should not be underestimated, scholars say. Paul probably has accepted this as a good chance, as that he has moved the church in the right place, or at least has one critically important church located, the one at Philippi, because it is, if he's executed, the gospel that he has helped to push is strategically located and firmly established in a church located on this strategically intercommerce highway with access to the sea, with access to Europe, with access to Asia. So we see one of the things he, lack of a better term, maybe a travel log plan. He mentions this outlook towards Spain, which would also, if he could get the church to Spain, would be another major strategic location to locate this thing. So Paul can look forward and is looking forward, if he survives, to locating this church in Spain, or him getting involved, or as one scholar says, he's making sure that idea gets put out there in case it's not already out there, that he wants to move the church to Spain also. I hope this gives you some idea of kind of an overview of how scholars see some of the important things that help us maybe better understand what's going to be here as we start our study directly in the text next week. Have a good study.